Now that you have a concept for your geofilter, we're now going to build off that idea and sketch it out on paper. Now you may be wondering, why are we doing the sketching part? Can't we just jump onto the computer? And yes, we can, and we will get to that part, but it's great to start with a sketch because computers are very limiting. They restrict us to boxes and shapes that they already kind of have. But if we have a sketch to start off with, then we could customize our approach of digitizing to our sketch rather than the other way around. Computers are great for translating your design, but it's not the best way to start off. So in this module, we're going to start the design off with a sketch, and then in the next module, we're going to bring that sketch into life in the digitizing phase. So in this module, we'll learn the basic design principles and get into the sketching of your geofilter, and then once we have that design, we're going to bring it into the computer, and then I'll show you how to digitize it in the next module. However, when you're sketching your geofilter, it helps to have an idea of what you want it to look like when it is digitized, so you could plan for that in your sketching phase. So I'm going to jump over to the computer and demonstrate a few fundamental design principles that will really help out your geofilter. Alright, so let's cover a few fundamental design principles that should help you out in the designing of your geofilter, and the first is contrast. Now, contrast is a general term that can be applied to a lot of different things, but in this case, we're going to be seeing what contrast means in terms of color. Now, colors have two parts to them. They have the hue, which is the visible pigment of the color, and then they have the value, which is the lightness and the darkness of the color. First, let's cover what contrast looks like as far as value goes. And something that has low contrast would be something that has a very dark value, something like black, and then placing something that has a very dark value as well, like a dark gray on top of that. And as you can tell, that there's not very much of a difference in value because they're both very dark in value. So it's kind of hard to make the distinction between the two. Now, something that has medium contrast would be something that has a medium value, something like a middle gray, on top of something that has a very dark value or very light value like black or white. Now, something that has a high amount of contrast would be something that has a high value, something like white, on top of something that has a very low value like black, or vice versa. Now let's look at this in color. Now if you take a look at the blue is very dark and low in value, as well as the orange on top is very low in value. So both of these are low in contrast. Now something that has a medium amount of contrast would be an orange that has a medium amount of value to it on top of something that has a dark value to it like a dark blue. Lastly, an example of a high amount of contrast would be something like an orange that has a high value to it and is very light on top of a dark blue that has a very low value to it. Next is the concept of balance and tension. When adding different elements to your design, you want to have a sense of harmony as well as a sense of variety. As an example, we have these two curvilinear lines that feel like they go together because they have similar curves to them and they are also the same color. Next, we have an example of two elements that are visibly different. We have a curvilinear line on top of a rectangular box, and on top of that, the curvilinear line is a different color from the box, so you can tell not only by the shape but the color that these two are visibly different, so it's creating a little bit more of a variety here. And finally, we have an example of two elements that are neither really similar nor different. And you want to try to avoid including elements in your design that are neither really similar or different, because this can tend to create visual noise that can be often unpleasing to view. So you either want to make them a little bit more similar or make them really different. Next is hierarchy. So hierarchy is about making the important things stand out and the less important things fall back. And the reason why this is important is because you want the viewer to immediately get the main part of your message without doing much work. You don't want them to do much work because if they have to think too hard about what the message actually is, they're just going to move on to something else. So hierarchy is a way to organize the information in order to make the most important things stand out. So in this example, we have a sentence that says, make the important things stand out. And we have stand out highlighted in green because we want to emphasize those words. So what we have to do is make sure that those are bigger than the rest. Now, a bad example of hierarchy would be something like this, with the words make and the being the biggest words. Now, when it comes to hierarchy, the biggest elements get the most attention. And if you think about it, if someone is just going to take a glance at this and they only read the biggest elements, would it still make sense? In this case, make and the still doesn't make sense by itself. I would have to read the rest. And that's the whole point of hierarchy. You want to pull out the items that make the most sense by themselves and make them the biggest, in case someone only reads those words. And a good example of hierarchy would be something like this, with the words stand and out being the biggest words. And because of the biggest words, they're the ones that I see first when I first glance at this. And if I only read those two words, the sentence would actually kind of make sense. I wouldn't really have to read the rest of the words. I see stand out, and it kind of is self-explanatory, but I could still then go and read the rest. So this is an example of how I just got the main message by just seeing the 2 to 3 key words in your sentence or the main image in your illustration. Lastly, a very important design fundamental is color. And as you can see on the left side of the screen is we have our color wheel with the very outer ring being the color in its regular hue and a medium value to it. And as you can see, as it goes towards the middle, it gets lighter in value until it gets to white. And this just goes back to our conversation of how colors have values to it, and you can add value or you could decrease the value in order to make it lighter or darker in order to play with that contrast. Now, all colors are derived from the 3 basic colors or the primary colors, which are blue, red, and yellow. And from those, you can see that we get the secondary colors if you mix either of them together, which are green, purple, and orange. And from there, you could go on to mix those colors together to get tertiary colors, such as blue, green, and red, violet, and red, orange. And from the color palettes, you can then go on to put these colors together in interesting ways to create color schemes. Now, color schemes are color combinations that have been established to look pleasing to the eye and can be used to enhance an artistic composition. Now, one common color scheme is monochromatic, and monochromatic literally means one color. So what this is you will have one color such as this green, as well as you can have variants of non-colors, which are whites, blacks, and grays. Next is an analogous color scheme, and this color scheme is having colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. And as you can see on the color wheel to the left, we have a red, and then we can add an orange and then a yellow since they're right next to each other. So this would be an example of an analogous color scheme. And finally is a complementary color scheme. And these are colors that are directly across from each other on the color wheel. Earlier we talked about how there's contrast in value between colors, but complementary is basically having a contrast in hue. You're putting together colors that are basically direct opposites, but they work well together because they're high contrast in hue. So in this example, an orange and a blue are directly across from each other on the color wheel, so these would be a complementary color scheme. So now that you have a better idea of the fundamental design principles to keep in mind, in the next lesson we're going to cover what are some of the fundamentals or keys that you can keep in mind when designing specifically for geofilters.